We ready? Yeah. Just let me know when you're done. Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, please. Kevin, why don't you and Vicky be leaders there and sit down? Or you could ignore me. Doesn't really matter. Ladies and gentlemen, if you take your seats, please. Thank you.
No, we're not. It's not this item. Let's talk another item.
Mr. Howard, if you'd introduce item number 5, please.
Yes, item number 5, consideration of a resolution to approve the UST LOP procedures and criteria for certification. By legislation this year, the Water Board is required to certify all the LOPs regarding their operation of the underground storage tank program. And so we have established some criteria for that, and the actual certification would be delegated to the executive director. Again, we have Kevin Graves, Liz Haven, and Teresa Barricott will be presented.
Tom, before we get started on that, looking at the time that's been allocated for this, it probably makes more sense to start the workshop after lunch. I know there are people here for that rather than to have them crowd in a lunch. I don't see how we're going to get this done much before noon, do you?
Well, I don't know how many people are here to talk on this item, but we estimated 60 minutes, so that would be accurate if that's what we... Liz, do you still think that's about the time this will take?
I think that's a maximum.
Yeah, I would say probably less than 60 minutes.
But you don't want to start the workshop and run it for 15 minutes and then leave. It's going to take a while, so...
You might want to tell people that we might be convening
why don't
again by...
Those of you that are here for the workshop, why don't we figure we're going to start it at 1 o'clock. We have a closed session that we need to do at some point today as well, just so you're, forewarned and don't have to. I know this keeps you right on the edge of your chairs no matter what we're talking about here, but if you'd rather have a little bit more lunch, feel free to do that, and the workshop will start at 1 o'clock. With that, Kevin.
Okay. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. The resolution before you today establishes criteria for the certification of local agencies in the underground storage tank cleanup program. This is in response to AB 1701. AB 1701 ends the current local agency regulatory structure for UST cleanup and replaces it with one in which the State Water Board adopts criteria and procedures for certifying local agencies, and then only certified local agencies would have authority to implement the program. I feel like there's a commotion behind me here.
They're so excited about what you're saying when they're talking about it.
We'll find out how many are here for this item, huh?
Maybe it was something I said. I don't know. One of my room clearing statements where everybody scowls and leaves.
So to paraphrase what I just said, that AB 1701 ends the current regulatory structure for UST cleanup for local agencies, and it replaces it with a new structure. And this new structure is one in which the State Water Board adopts criteria and procedures for certifying local agencies, and then only certified agencies would have authority to implement the program. This is the culmination of over 2 years of discussions between state and regional board staff, LOP, and Coupa agency staff, industry groups, and stakeholders. It was generally agreed in these discussions that a certification program similar to the DTSC local oversight program would be a good model, but with a more streamlined application process. These discussions ultimately led to the legislature drafting 1701, AB 1701. But in doing so, the legislature set some very tight timeframes. The bill was not an urgency measure, and so went into effect just 1 week ago on January 1st. A key provision is that the current authority for local agencies to implement the UST cleanup program ends 6 months from now. It ends 6 months from now on June 30th, 2013. So within this next 6-month period, to continue to have a local agency program, the board must adopt certification criteria, local agencies must prepare and submit application package to the board, staff must review those application packages for compliance with the criteria, and then the board must certify those agencies that acceptably meet the criteria. In addition, for those agencies that will receive funding contracts from the cleanup fund, in parallel, contract language and budgets must be developed, vetted by both the state and local contract offices, and the contracts completed by that same June 30th deadline. So there's a lot that has to happen in the next 6 months. To allow ourselves and others as much time as possible to complete the process by that June 30th deadline, our staff have worked diligently to create the criteria document and the resolution that's before you as quickly as possible, while still meeting the requirements of the statute and balancing the needs of internal and external stakeholders. Since today is the first board meeting that the board could legally act on this, we think we've met the test of speed. We also think we've met the test of balancing stakeholder needs for the following reasons. It allows most of the existing larger local programs to submit a streamlined application package that documents their existing program and agrees to implement the low-threat closure implementation plan that was recently adopted by the board. And that low-threat closure implementation plan is referenced in the documents, and they would be signing up to agree to implement that. For smaller agencies, with those with under 70 cases, those agencies would have to submit the same application package, but also include a plan for how the agency will phase out their program as caseloads decrease over time. And as we just heard from Liz, that we do believe that the UST cleanup program is phasing out as the funding goes away and caseloads decrease. For 2 agencies that have demonstrated the lowest closure rates over the past 5 years, they would submit the same application package as the others, but would also include a plan for how they would improve their closure rates to achieve a higher caseload closure rate over time. It's quite likely that some agencies, particularly the ones with only a handful of cases, will choose to drop out of the program and transfer their cases to the regional board. State board staff plan to play a role in triaging these cases to ease the burden on any of the affected regional boards. We received 3 comments on this item from San Mateo County, Orange County, and Humboldt County. All 3 generally lament the short time frame for development and of the criteria, and we and staff agree that it's been a short time frame, and we've had to work very quickly. They also take issue with the need for phase-out plans or improvement plans for some of the agencies. And with this, staff does not agree. We feel that phase-out plans for smaller agencies and improvement plans for the lower performing agencies are prudent measures that recognize the whole program is shrinking and that we must use our remaining resources in the most effective manner. Staff recommends that you adopt the resolution as amended by the change sheet. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Richard Sanders.
Good morning, Richard Sanchez,
Good morning.
Orange County Environmental Health, and just wanted to, I spent some time up here in Sacramento to let you know that Orange County is very interested in this proposal, and we agree that there is need to close cases as soon as possible in an expeditious manner as long as public health and protection of the environment occurs. And I would take issue with one of the statements made that the comment letter that we wrote, we agree that closure has to occur. We do, however, take issue with a couple of things. One of them, which is the way this was rolled out could have been handled a little bit better, first of all. There was the cliff scenario that was mentioned earlier was basically the notification that we received in Orange County, not only me, but my staff. And that probably could have been handled a little bit better by the Water Board staff. In addition, we need to know what the expectations are. Currently, there were no percentages that were given, and then the 9% number was thrown out. And when we had the discussion about the 9% closure rate, it seemed to be arbitrary. And US EPA has a standard, I believe, of a 7% closure rate. I am actually fine with the 9% closure rate, but it seems like there should be some thought given to what that closure rate is. Is it mainly just closed cases, or is there some recognition of the way these last remaining cases are going to be handled and closed? And finally, as I mentioned, there seems to be some retroactive expectations that were placed on some of the LOPs. We will meet the standards that are given to us as long as we know what those standards for performance are. And I think in this case, we didn't always know what the expectation was. So and also, Anthony Martinez from the LOP manager is here, and I think he'd like to make some comments as well, if that's okay.
Thank you, Richard. Kevin, in my briefing, and I assume with the other board members, we talked about the retroactive component of this and the methodology that you had to try and make it equitable, where parties may be being held to a standard that they weren't aware, or a performance standard that they weren't aware of. Could you discuss that a little bit? Because, I didn't, if you brought it up when you were making your presentation, it went over my head, but I think that's an important factor, because the retroactive component of it, as you'll recall, did concern me as well. So.
The legislation specifically required us to look at past performance as one of the criteria to be considered. And that past performance includes things that have happened prior to, this certification. And so we had to look at the data that came, that's available in GeoTracker and other places. We looked at dollars, we looked at staffing, we looked at the time of age of cases, we looked at various different types of data that were available. And we recognized that case closure was one of the primary measures that had been looked at over the past, both through EPA and through us. And so we mapped that over time, and we could have set a closure rate of 6%. The performance measure could have been 2% or 5%, or but there was a clear break between at the 9%, actually it's less than that, and the rest. So there were two agencies that were well below the pack. And so we felt, in meeting the needs of the legislature to want us to look at past performance, that having an improvement plan for those two agencies was a prudent way to address the legislature's need to look at past performance and yet have a path to eventual certification for all agencies.
Richard, if you'd like to come up again, if that's not clear, because it was something that caught my attention when I was originally briefed on this, and to be honest with you, some of the details that Kevin just went over had escaped me. So there was that legislative requirement to look back into the past. I would acknowledge, as I think we all would.
I'd like to add to my comment that the cliff scenario that you mentioned, was indeed, there was not the original the draft that went out did not have a waiver criteria for that. And so it appeared to be a cliff. And that was an oversight on staff's part due to the, speed that we were all going on this. We had a waiver for the other, but not a waiver for that. And so we included that language very readily when it was pointed out that it was there. And we're sorry that it
And it did
effect.
cause quite a bit of concern among staff because it not only went out to the managers, but it was also at the staff level. And of course, first thought is, I no longer have a job.
We have a policy where we do that periodically just to make everybody's life a little miserable.
It woke them up.
We don't do it very often, but
It did wake people up. And I recognize what's being said here about past performance. But again, I do have to stick with the fact that as long as we know what those criteria are, now that we know, for example, and I'm believe me, I'm thankful that we have the opportunity to show improvement in our LOP. And we probably will, more than likely, will be reaching that 10% closure rate this year. So I think we're going to be fine. But I think there needs to be more of a discussion with the LOPs on how this plays out. I recognize that there was a time factor. So perhaps that was part of the reason that it seemed very sudden and arbitrary. And perhaps that was, like you said, because of that time factor. And perhaps just in the future, a recognition of the impact that it does have on the locals when those discussions occur and when decisions are made.
I think one thing we can always consistently say around here, Richard, is we try and provide an opportunity for that kind of public outreach, if you will, and I'm comfortable that if requested, the staff will facilitate that, because it's certainly not our goal to see how many people we can get to fail a test. The goal is to see how we can improve a system as we've been requested to do, and we can't do it without your help. So I see Kevin nodding and not glaring at me like he does sometimes. So I'm comfortable we'll have this done. So
Actually,
I appreciate your consideration.
actually, in defense of Kevin, which I very rarely do,
I
I'm
didn't mean to get her started.
I'm curious though. I'm curious though, because what would you suggest in terms of how staff could have done this differently? Because they sent out a preliminary draft to the roundtable in order to hold a phone call, conference call, or something before any formal draft went out. They had the discussion and made the changes so that when the formal draft went out, the concerns that they heard were addressed. So, at least in my opinion, they reached out, they shared an informal draft, they had the discussion, they heard the concerns, they incorporated the changes before the formal draft went out. So, I mean, I have great and high expectations for all program staff in terms of public engagement and participation, and to me, they fulfilled that in this endeavor. How would you suggest it be done differently?
I would disagree with that, because I think even though it may have been an informal draft, it's not always at the staff level. When they see a document from the state board, they take it very seriously. So is this a draft that is something that we can have a discussion on, or is this a draft as notification of what's going to occur? So I think messaging is very important, and I think we should all be mindful of that.
Okay, that's a good point. So I guess, Kevin, you will try to make it clearer next time that when something is sent to the roundtable for the first time, it's a discussion draft.
And I believe that, I'm not trying to be argumentative here, believe me, but what the board wants us to do, I believe we did that. We held informal meetings.
Next time, though, put discussion draft in bold, big font at the beginning.
You've got our attention now, board member, and I think further discussions, we realize now that this is something that the board is taking very seriously, the closure policy. I can see that this is something that is definitely high on your agenda, and there's a recognition of that, and in some way, you got our attention. So maybe that's what you wanted to happen. That's what happened, and we are going to be working with staff and make sure we get those closure rates done.
And I would add, I mean, you understand that not only do we want good work to be done and for it to be expeditiously closed when needed, but the fund is running out of money.
Oh, and you know,
and I know your staff know that, so that's probably.
And you know, many of the things that have been stated, I don't disagree. I started in environmental health in 1984, and in those days, this program is going to eventually be going away. That was in 1984. Here we are in 2013. I get it, but and it's real, and I think we are getting to that point where the number of cases is significantly smaller in Orange County from 2,000 to less than 400. So we have I appreciated Board Member Moore's comments about the good work that has been done by the LOPs, and I think there needs to be some recognition of that. And we are making every effort. I can speak, I think, for all the LOPs that we are making every effort to do that.
Thank you for articulating your concerns, Richard. I appreciate that. Anthony?
Thank you. My name is Anthony Martinez. I'm the program manager for the Orange County LOP and a few other programs. Basically, in regard to the closure criteria that was included in the draft document, we sent a comment letter to State Board staff within a few days of getting that first draft and giving some suggestions. We participated in the conference call, and we felt it's very important, not just on this issue, but on things about GeoTracker and a lot of other issues, the low threat closure policy, to give an honest assessment of what we think. It may not win the battle at the end of the day, but at least we let them know what we think. And so we do want to participate with them. And we did participate in the conference call. We were made aware that they had to submit the revised draft the next day. So that evening, we stayed a little late and sent suggested changes that didn't quite make it into the new revised draft. The biggest concern that we had was that retroactive, the way this number was pulled out of someplace and was applied retroactively. Our contract with the State Board to implement the LOP for the last 5 years has had a closure number in there, 20 cases, which works out to about 5%. In the last year, we actually exceeded that closure number, and we achieved about 7%. So when that 9% was pulled out and presented to us, it completely blindsided us, and we didn't know what, really how we're going to address that. Going forward, now that the low threat closure policy has been adopted and is very clear on what the State Board expects for these cases, we've seen a very large uptick in additional closures at our office. Right now we're sitting on close to 15 cases that are ready for closure, waiting only for well abandonments to occur. So now we're waiting on RPs to follow through and get things done. If we, rather than have a criteria that's imposed as part of a waiver, if we're instead provided a criteria that's expected going forward, that would help. That will let us know what it is we need to accomplish in the coming years. And I don't see any problem with achieving numbers 7, 8, 9, 10% closures per year. As we start winnowing down these cases, we are going to end up with sites that are much more difficult to close, and maybe those sites start getting transferred to the regional boards. If you look at our overall historical closure rate, going back to 1984 when we first started working on underground tank cleanups, and then going into the pilot program back in 1988, and then going into 1981 with the LOP, our total closure rate is about 81%, and the average life of all of those cases is closer to 6 years than the 17. The reason that it's 17 on open cases is because many of them are the harder cases, much more widespread contamination, much more recalcitrant to remediation. And those are the cases that are going to be left and that the regional boards will have to deal with in the future at some point. But we are working very, very diligently to get cases closed and to move cases from remediation into verification and closure. More than half of our cases are already in remediation. We have a very small percentage that are still in assessment, very small percentage. And being a county that's as densely populated as Orange County is, with as many drinking water supply wells and such a high reliance on drinking water, we've always taken the groundwater protection aspect of this very seriously. And when we do get a well that's impacted, it's a personal blow to me. We've dropped the ball on that one site, but we have hopefully prevented that from happening at many more sites over the years. So with that, I'll take my seat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anthony.
If I could build upon that comment by asking staff, in Resolution 2012-62, the board directed staff to work with the regulatory agencies to develop performance measures and indicators. And what the gentleman said about, knowing what is expected going forward, I think those performance measures would be the response to the comment he had. How is that effort? I know it's only been a few months, but has any work been done to look at these performance metrics? And given that the certifications need to happen, by July 1st, and various plans, closure to pathway to closure plans are required by the end of the year, when do you expect, or when do you anticipate that those performance measures would be developed and be communicated to people?
Well, we're only starting that effort right now. There's a meeting on this Friday, with the Office of Research Planning and Performance to discuss how the low-threat closure implementation plan would affect performance measures for both the regional boards and the local agencies across the program. We've been pretty busy over the holidays here, and so we've been working on getting the GeoTracker screens in place so that agencies could be doing their low-threat closure policy checklists, do their path to closure plans, develop performance reporting of those measures. What the actual performance measures are going to be through ORPP, we have yet to establish. But I would imagine that over the next few months we would be able to establish those.
Yes, and this is Liz Haven with the Division of Financial Assistance, and just to let everybody know that we will be taking over the contracting administration part of the LOP contracts for the July 1st and onward fiscal years. And so what we're hoping to do, and we'll participate with the performance measure meeting that Kevin just mentioned in that effort, and what we would hope to do is to incorporate it into the LOP contracts, because that does seem only fair that the LOPs know what the expectations are.
Great.
And just to follow up on that, closure rates have been something we focused on in the past as a rate. And I think that with the low-threat closure implementation plan, closure rates will become less important, and what will be more important is why is the case open.
Exactly.
And so we're hoping that there is a significant spike in closures as that plan is implemented, and then the rate will really be dependent upon what the environmental impacts are going forward. And so this whole discussion of performance measures and closure, the term closure rate may actually become archaic, we hope.
Great. If there are no other comment cards, I did meet with staff briefly before the meeting and have some requests in terms of additions to the criteria and to the resolution. The first thing that I would suggest is there's a sort of a mismatch in terms of timing. In Resolution 2012-62, the board directed that the regulatory agencies, including the LOPs, review their existing cases using the framework in the low-threat closure policy to determine which ones could be closed and which one, and develop rationale for which one needs to stay open. And the deadline for doing that is August 16th of this year, but the deadline for certification is July 1st of this year. So I asked staff to think about how we could include as part of the criteria for certification an evaluation of the LOP's progress towards accomplishing that first review by August 16 of this year. And do you have a recommendation on that?
I think that August 16th was when the reviews needed to be done, but the path to closure plan actually was December.
End of the year, yes, December, yep. But I guess what I'm trying to say is as we make the decision on certification, I want some indication, some assessment of how the LOP is doing. I don't want to wait until the end of this year. I want some determination of that factor as part of the certification process.
And I'll just point out that even though, as Kevin mentions, it's the statutory timeframe is July 1st, because we in the division are going to have to prepare and negotiate and sign and administratively complete the contracts, we actually have to back up a number of months from July to have the certifications issue settled. So I don't...
Will it be an kind of an interim certification or something like that? I mean, what happens, this is a scenario, what happens if you certify an entity and then you find out they don't turn in a report as to how they're going, they are low performing and they don't turn in a report? Do they stay certified?
No, there is a revocation certification withdrawal
Oh, is there?
provision.
Okay.
Which actually leads me into my next line of request, and that is, once the initial evaluation has been done by August 16th, and once the path to closure for the remaining sites had been submitted by the end of December, I don't want to wait, 3 years until the next evaluation in order to determine how, how well the path closure plan, have been prepared, and how well the initial evaluations have been conducted, and perhaps more importantly, how consistently or how well the LOP is actually implementing their path to closure plan. So I want the executive director to have, or actually I want to require the executive director to do, I guess, perhaps not a full-blown review of the LOP, but definitely to evaluate their progress in closing the low-threat sites and their progress in developing and implementing their path to closure plans sooner than the 3-year period that is currently being proposed for evaluation of the LOP.
Well, we have that being set up in GeoTracker, and so we can report that at any time, and if we could make that a part of the executive director report by providing what the current status of those by agency is, how many cases have been reviewed, how many have not, so you would be able to...
I guess I wanted something a little bit stronger because of the comments I've heard about making very clear what our expectations are. And I want to make very clear my expectations are that, one, if the LOP is not closing low-threat sites per our policy, is not put in a full faith effort to develop path to closure plans and implementing them, I want to send a very clear message that not just that the executive director will report back in his executive director's report, but that he will evaluate and take action on those certification as part of the delegated authority to him.
So would it work if we were to add some language to the resolution directing staff, Water Board staff, to review the path to closure plans that are submitted by the LOPs as required by Water Board Resolution 2012-0062 and reevaluate certification of the LOPs by what would be 6 months after the due date for those plans, which would be July 1st, 2014?
That would be very good. So that addressed my second comment. What about my first comment in terms of looking at the progress the LOPs are making? I mean, I respect all the comments that have been made about how they know that we're serious now about the LOP, about the low threat closure implementation of the policy. But I also want to get some indication of what actions the LOP have taken to conduct that initial review to be completed by August 16th of this year. I know that that resolution 2012-0062 requires that they conduct a review by August 16th and put in GeoTracker by August 16th, I guess, the criteria or rationale for those sites that are to remain open. But that information will not be available to you when you're making the certification decision that has to be made by July 1st.
Right. There's two questions there, it seems to me. One is, how are we going to certify an agency, right? And then the other is, how are we going to be doing overall quality control for the program, not only for LOPs, but also for regional boards and how they're doing their reviews. It's probably not feasible to do too much of the quality control work during the certification process, because I'm hoping that the packages are going to be coming in February, right? And we're working really hard to try to get this done so that the contracts can get done, so that people can know that they have a job on June 30th. However, moving forward, it's our expectations, our plan, at least staff in DWQ, to be looking at using our resources to review petitions, to review the sites that have been requested closure and denied closure, and also to be reviewing the reviews that these folks have been doing. That essentially is our job that the board has asked us to do through the low threat closure policy implementation plan. And so that is what we intend to do over the next year, is doing these reviews. How we're going to capture that in GeoTracker and how we're going to judge those reviews on whether or not they are suitable, we still haven't gotten to that point because we've been pretty busy putting this stuff together. But that is our plan in DWQ, to do precisely what you want.
Always, that's good. You're much kinder than I am, I think. So given what you just said, looking at attachment B, the LOP agency application for certification, my just sort of quick glance in, there's a statement there, there's a section that begins, by submission thereof, I warrant that the following statements are true and correct. Where in these list of items does it indicate that the LOP is committed or on target or conducting the reviews that are required in Resolution 2012-62?
Well, it's in there a number of places. It is not spelled out with those particular words, because we use LOP procedures to refer back to the criteria document, and plans, policies, plans, resolutions of the State Water Board. And so we didn't focus on that particularly in this words, but we want them implementing all of the plans and policies and all of the resolutions that the State Water Board, and that was merely one of them. That was the legal strategy for wording it the way it certainly could be spelled out clearer.
And I do have a suggestion if the board wanted to spell it out, which would be in the criteria itself, under the closure discussion, which would be in section I guess, the place where the closure rates are provided. It goes on to provide for a waiver of the closure criterion that we discussed earlier. And if you wanted, you could add to what the State Board Executive Director determination is. I'm looking at the section that begins, the State Water Board Executive Director or designee may waive this criterion. If you're with me, it's the top of page 3. Okay, you could add, if the director or designee determines that, and this is the new language, the agency has made adequate progress in implementing resolution number 2012-0062.
Excellent, thank you. And with the language proposed by Liz and the language read by Teresa, I would move for adoption of this item. Sorry, with the change sheet too, before Michael looks at me.
And that's good. What you read into the record, you used the word agency, and I think you may want to call it a local agency.
Thank you, you're correct, local agency.
And with my addition, I will second the motion, and thank you for your efforts on this.
Any other discussion? All those in favor, thank you for your input on that, Tim. All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Thank you. So, Mr. Lawfer, would you like to have closed session?
I would recommend that the board go ahead and hold closed session now. I think it will be relatively brief, and then the board members will be able to have lunch and fortify themselves for an afternoon of stormwater.
And we'll use
So the board will now retire into closed session on the one disclosed agenda item